Hi everyone. I had a request to look at the black side of the Najdorf in the line where white plays bishop to c4. So let's have a look at a little bit of the theory that's in the book Starting Out the Sicilian by John Ems, and then we'll look at a game between Kasparov and Gelfand that was also analyzed in the book. Okay, so the Najdorf is an open Sicilian, begins like this, and it's characterized right here by the move a6. So a6 is keeping pieces off of b5, specifically it's stopping a bishop check, and it prepares the move e5. I talked about this in previous videos. It's also a nice waiting move, and it helps black expand on the queen side with b5. Okay, so white has a number of replies here. If I look at the master's database, most common is bishop to e3, which is called the English attack. But then close behind it is bishop to g5, which can lead to a lot of things, including the poison pawn variation. And then there's just classical development with bishop to e2. But the fourth most popular move is this move bishop to c4 that we're going to look at now. The database in Lichess calls this the Lipnitsky attack, but the book that I'm referring to by John Ems calls this the Fischer attack and says this is a favorite move of Bobby Fischer, but also Garry Kasparov liked to play this as well, and so did Nigel Short, who played it against Kasparov. And it's supposedly very aggressive. So what's the point? Well, white in this line is going to be castling kingside instead of queenside. So white is clearing the way for kingside castling. This looks like a pretty aggressive place for the bishop. It's pointed at the f7 square. So it can be very active along this diagonal, as we will see. So it is a logical choice. Now, whenever I have seen this move in the past, the thing that always ran through my head, not knowing any theory at all here, is, yeah, but what about this move b5? You just hit the bishop right away. Well, amongst other possibilities, white can simply play bishop to d5 here and give up the bishop pair and bring this pawn to the d5 square. But I wondered if white keeps the bishop on this diagonal and puts it on b3, can you just chase away the defender of that e4 pawn? And that's not advisable. Apparently b4 here is a mistake. And white can continue and do well with either knight a4 or knight d5. And black really should not take this pawn. Queen to f3 follows, and just take a look at the position here. Was it really worth pushing this pawn from b7 all the way to b4 just to grab this one pawn with a piece that you moved twice in the opening? Look at the vast differences in development. White has 4 pieces developed and is ready to castle. Black has only 1 and is not ready to castle. This queen is exerting pressure down that diagonal where the rook is sitting, and these knights in the center of the board are powerful, and this bishop can come to life. There's pressure on the f7 square. This is a very dangerous way for black to play. Not to mention, white is actually hitting the b4 pawn and can win the pawn back. So expanding like that is not a good idea. Putting the pawn on b5 is a possibility here. That's not really the mistake, but then following it up with b4 and trying to grab that pawn on e4 is the mistake. However, b5 may be a little premature. I looked at the master's database, and John Ems, the author of the book, agrees that b5 is not at all close to the most popular choice here, which is e6. So e6 is just blunting this bishop and creating this small pawn center, we call it. So these 2 pawns are controlling these 4 squares. And once you move to e6, you might say that you've transposed into another line of the Sicilian called the Scheveningen, or however you pronounce that, the Scheveningen, which you normally get at through a different move order. Instead of the Najdorf move a6, this move e6 is the Scheveningen. And in the Scheveningen, bishop to c4 is a line, and then a6 is the recommendation there. So you can get to the same position by that move order instead. Okay, so we will still call this the Najdorf, though, although I did have to look this up in the Scheveningen chapter instead of the Najdorf chapter. Okay, so yeah, that's a good move, just to blunt the power of that bishop, which was going towards the e7 square. So black's plan is going to be to put that bishop on e7 and castle kingside. What is white going to do? Well, it turns out the most popular move here is a little strange to me. It's bishop to b3, and John Ems says that's just a prophylactic move. It's saving a tempo in case b5 comes and attacks the bishop, or even d5 comes and attacks the bishop. And so the bishop is already pre-defending itself by moving to b3. I don't know if I fully understand that or agree with that. I don't see the harm in waiting for black to provoke the bishop before falling back to b3, but perhaps falling back to b3 first will give white more options in reply to moves like b5. And that move is usually necessary anyway, because black will be playing b5 at some point. You can delay that move. You can castle instead. That's the second most popular move besides bishop to b3. But a lot of those lines seem to transpose. So we'll just follow up from here. Now, black normally does expand on the queen side with b5 here, gaining space. And then white can castle here, and then bishop d7, getting ready to castle. Black's getting ready to castle kingside. And now there's two different main ways of playing this position. John Ems says that queen to f3 is the modern way of playing the position. And he says that this is the idea of getting your pieces as active as possible rather than playing for pawn moves and pawn breaks. Just trying to develop your pieces and getting them active. So queen to f3 comes with a threat. Notice that queen is lined up with the a8 rook. So white is threatening to push the e5 pawn, and that would be a win of material because the knight and the rook would be under attack. So how should black defend against this move, queen to f3? Well, there's basically only two moves that do the job, and the most popular is queen, not that one, queen to c7. The other possibility is queen to b6, but queen to c7 seems to be really the move of choice. What's the point of this move? Well, the point is to support your bishop coming to the b7 square, so if white does play a5, which he does not typically do, then you can save your material by attacking the queen and then moving the knight afterwards. So that's the point of queen to c7. You may wonder, well, can you just play bishop to b7 here and just pin that pawn? Well, if you play bishop to b7, which the engine really hates, that allows a very interesting sacrifice that the players of the black pieces should always be on the lookout for in this bishop to c4 line. White can play bishop takes e6. That bishop has just left defense of that square. And if black takes back, which is the best line, then white takes another pawn and attacks the queen and the g7 pawn here. So the queen moves to safety, knight takes g7 check, the king moves, the knight falls back to safety. And white has, looks like 3 pawns for the piece, and black's position is shattered. If you put this on the engine, it says plus 1.7 for white. King is in danger, and white already has 3 pawns for the piece. So that's why bishop to b7 is not played in this line with queen to f3. Instead, queen to c7 is the recommendation to prepare bishop to b7 in response to e5. Okay, but instead of e5, the normal move, by far the preferred move in the database, is queen to g3, which attacks the g7 pawn. It also releases the f pawn to come forward. Well, then black should castle to protect g7, and if white plays bishop to h6 to attack this pawn, then John Ems recommends dropping the knight back to e8. A good move to remember. It looks a little passive, but it turns out it's probably the safest way to defend the g7 point. The only other way to defend it, besides pushing the g-pawn and losing the exchange, is putting the knight here. But apparently queen to g4 is annoying, in the words of John Ems. The engine says it's okay to play like this. You don't even have to defend your knight necessarily, because if white takes it, then you can take the bishop. But apparently it is annoying. You can defend the knight with queen to c5. So if you want to look into that, that's fine, but I think knight to e8 is the preferred move. Yeah, when I'm looking at the Masters database, knight to e8 is the only move played 338 out of 338 times, even though the engine says knight to h5 is just about equivalent. Strange. Okay, so knight e8. All right, and we'll see a game that continues from here in just a moment, but let me back up and look at another major line besides queen to f3. Another way white can play is with pawns. He can push his pawn to f4. And the point of this move, besides gaining space here on the king side, is to push the pawn to f5. That's often a plan white takes in this line, because he wants to get his bishop, his light square bishop, active, and so he wants to put pressure on this e6 pawn, either force it to trade or push forward and open up that diagonal for that light squared bishop. So that's the point of f4. And then from here, black can play, we're going to give you a sample line here, bishop to b7, f5, and then whenever f5 is played, I've noticed that the usual response is e5. I think, unfortunately, you do have to open the diagonal for the bishop in favor of keeping the f file closed against the rook. And it does create a hole in your position here on d5 that we saw in other lines of the Najdorf. But nevertheless, black is pretty solid here, and the engine says he's just fine. In fact, the engine prefers black by about half a pawn in this line. Okay, so the knight here that's under attack typically falls back to e2. Black can develop knight b d7. By the way, there's a pawn hanging here, but apparently John Ems says not to take it, and I think the engine agrees. White gets a lot of counterplay if you take this pawn. White takes back, black takes back. Knight to c3 hits the bishop, bishop falls back. Queen to g4 attacks g7. Bishop to f6 can defend things, but white apparently has a lot of compensation for his pawn. In fact, when I turn the engine on, it says plus 0.6 for white, even though white's down a pawn here. Kind of hard to see exactly why. I guess some minor pieces coming to the d5 square. I don't know, maybe the h-pawn can push. I mean, these pawns look pretty good to me. You'll have to look into this. But it's not played, so black doesn't take that pawn on e4. Okay, so I wanted to say one more thing. If you're having trouble in this line with bishop to b4 because of this move f4 followed by f5 and opening up this diagonal, and you face a lot of pressure, then you do have another option I noticed that was barely mentioned in the John Ems book. So let's go back to the beginning. After bishop c4, e6, bishop b3, Instead of playing b5 that we looked at, another possible move here is knight bd7. And you'll see the point here. If white does some sensible developing move like castling, then move the knight to c5 and just challenge that bishop right away. So that's another possible maneuver, not to mention you're putting pressure on the e4 pawn as well. And white really can't keep this bishop in this line. I mean, you can move it here and you can chase it back, I suppose, but you're going to get it off of that diagonal. White will typically just give it up for the knight. So that's another way to play. I'm not going to look at any deeper theory along this line, but if you have trouble with that light squared bishop, then try that. Okay, let's take a look at the game Kasparov versus Gelfand, which occurred in Linares in 1993. So Kasparov had the white pieces. This was the only game that was in the chapter in the book I'm reading, but we'll take a close look at it. So there's the Najdorf, and there's the bishop to c4 line. So e6 was played to blunt that bishop, bishop to b3 prophylactic move, b5 expansion on the queen side, castles, bishop e7 getting ready to castle. And Kasparov prefers the queen f3 line piece play rather than the pawn break f4 and f5. So he's going to put a lot of pressure on black's king side with his pieces. Queen to c7 was played by Gelfand, as we mentioned, in order to counter the move e5 with bishop to b7. So the queen's supporting the bishop there on b7. Kasparov plays queen g3, hitting the g7 pawn, as we mentioned. Gelfand castles, bishop to h6. And now... Gelfand plays knight e8. Just as we said, he retreats the knight here. Okay, so then game continued rook a d1. And let's see. Yeah, bishop to d7. I noticed in a lot of games, I mean, I was expecting this bishop to go to b7 because of this pawn formation. It looks like you prepared a fianchetto there. But in a lot of these games, this bishop is going to d7. Let me fix the board here. And the reason that bishop is going to d7 rather than b7 is because it's more of a defensive piece on d7. Remember, there are sacrifices possible on this e6 square. Bishop takes e6, f takes e6, knight takes e6, forks the queen and the rook, and there's more pressure on g7. So this bishop is needed here to defend this pawn. Okay, knight f3 was played. Again, Kasparov is not pushing his f pawn. He's just bringing more pieces toward the king side. b4 was criticized by the author as being too ambitious. He says that he should just develop with knight to c6. He says that's necessary, but it's kind of funny. The engine slightly prefers the move b4 anyway, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's the better move for humans to play. So John Ems could be perfectly correct. But Kasparov drops the knight back to e2, and then a5 is a threat to trap the bishop. So you're getting some queenside counterplay here, and you're threatening the bishop, but you're not really doing anything about the defense of your king side. You have another knight that just made its way over to the king side here, and you're not really defending. Okay, knight f4 was played with the intention of putting that knight on h5 and then really breaking through on the g7 square. Okay, so Gelfand here plays king to h8. I think it's a necessary defensive move. Kasparov just let his bishop on b3 go. What would happen if Gelfand went after it and tried to take it? Well, then there's bishop takes g7, forcing knight takes, and then the knight comes to h5 with pressure on g7, a mate threat on g7, and the only way to defend it is to put the bishop on f6. The knight takes the bishop with check, the king goes to h8, queen goes to h4 and threatens another mate, this time on the h7 square, And it looks like the only way to prolong the misery here is to push the pawn to h5, but then queen to f4, and it's over. The queen is coming to the h6 square with a mate. Black can prolong it for a couple moves, but that's it. Black can give up their knight, I suppose, but that's all. So it's a mate. So you don't have time to win that bishop on b3. This move king to h8 was a necessary defense, which now threatens the bishop on h6. So Kasparov moves his bishop back, knight to f6 was played, queen to h4, and now a blunder. The author says again, a knight to c6 is necessary. I suppose this knight lends further support to this bishop, and maybe it can come to e5 if necessary. You just need to complete your development. But Gelfand makes the blunder bishop to b5. Now, why is that a blunder? Well, we will see what happens here. Kasparov just ignores his rook on f1 and plays knight to d4. So a lot of pressure now on this point right here. Gelfand played his bishop back for defense, but let's see what would have happened if he had taken the rook. Well, then knight takes pawn, f takes knight, bishop takes pawn. Bishop taking the pawn is stronger than knight taking, which would have forked the rook and queen, because the bishop is controlling the g8 square, and there's a mate threat now. Knight to g6 would be an immediate mate. G6 can prolong it because you're getting an escape square here on g7. But knight takes g6 check, king to g7, and then queen to h6 is mate anyway. So there's not much to do. You could try pushing here, but then the bishop is going to take, and the file is going to be open, and so you're dead in that position as well. Okay, so you don't have time to take that rook. Gelfand just drops the bishop back for defense, and that's why bishop to b5 was a bad move in the first place if you're just going to have to move it right back after the knight came to d4. All right, and then Kasparov sacrifices on e6, which I think even an amateur player like me would do. F takes e6. Now this time the knight takes e6 is, I think, the best move. Queen has to move, and it moves to a7. e5. Okay, so you're just attacking the knight on f6 here. And I think the point is, after Gelfand captures the pawn, you just cleared the d file for your rook. And now Kasparov trades down. He takes the rook, and then he takes the knight. And then he drops the rook to the back rank, skewering the bishops, or attacking both of these bishops here. And there's not much you can do. Gelfand plays knight d7 so that the rook is defending the bishop on e8. But then Kasparov played queen to g4 with a mate threat, queen to g8. And so Gelfand resigned. There's nothing he can do. You can try to block that with bishop to g7, but then the queen just comes to e6 and renews the mate. And it's a mate in 2 from here. I think the mate in 2 is just ditching this piece, and then there's a mate on the next move. This bishop can't even move, it's pinned. Okay, so that's an excellent example of how powerful that bishop can be in this line, bishop to c4. Unfortunately, I don't have any games prepared where black wins, but you've got some ideas now, and if you don't like that bishop, remember that line I mentioned where you bring the knight to c5 and try to get rid of it early on. Okay, thanks for watching the video. I hope you learned something. I sure did.